In this episode, we're going to talk about a kind of document that quietly shapes day-to-day security behavior more than most people realize. Practical guidelines that help teams make consistent choices without forcing every situation into a rigid, one-size-fits-all rule. Standardization is often misunderstood as locking everyone into the same exact steps. But in real organizations, that approach usually breaks because different teams use different workflows, different systems, and different constraints. The goal is to standardize the outcomes and the decision logic, not to standardize every keystroke, so people can move quickly without drifting into risky improvisation. Guidelines are especially valuable when a policy is clear about what must be protected and procedures are clear about the critical steps for high-risk tasks. But teams still need help choosing safe patterns in the many in-between moments that policies and procedures do not cover. By the end, you should be able to explain what makes a guideline scale, why tool-agnostic guidance is often stronger than tool-specific instruction, and how to make consistency feel helpful instead of oppressive. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A guideline is a documented, recommended way to achieve a security goal, written so it can be followed in many different contexts without requiring a single fixed method. It sits in a sweet spot between a policy that states what must be true and a procedure that describes how to do a specific task, and that position gives it a unique job. A guideline reduces ambiguity by offering a preferred pattern, but it also respects reality by acknowledging that not every team can use the same approach. In a growing organization, ambiguity multiplies because more people are making more decisions, and every ambiguous decision creates the chance of a different answer. Guidelines reduce that variation by giving teams a common direction, which lowers the chance that security posture becomes uneven across systems. Beginners sometimes think guidelines are optional fluff that can be ignored, but in practice, guidelines are how an organization teaches consistent judgment at scale. When guidelines are written well, they become the default way teams solve recurring problems, which makes security outcomes more predictable even when tools differ. To understand why guidelines scale, it helps to separate the idea of a stable intent from a flexible implementation. A stable intent is the security outcome that should remain the same no matter what team is doing the work, such as limiting access, protecting sensitive data, or ensuring important events are detectable. Flexible implementation is the reality that one team might accomplish that outcome through one workflow, while another team accomplishes it through a different workflow, and both can be acceptable if they preserve the intent. A scaling guideline describes the stable intent clearly, then describes the preferred patterns that tend to achieve that intent across many environments. It avoids tying the recommendation to a single tool, a single vendor, or a single internal team structure, because those details change over time and cause governance to break during transitions. This is why guideline writing is really an exercise in identifying what must not change and what can change safely. When you get that boundary right, teams can adapt without losing consistency, and that is the heart of scaling. A practical guideline also needs a clear audience and a clear use case, because guidelines fail when they try to be everything to everyone at once. If the guideline is meant for engineers building systems, it should be written so engineers can apply it to design decisions without having to translate vague language. If it is meant for analysts handling operational tasks, it should be written so analysts can apply it to repeatable choices, like how to prioritize events or how to evaluate requests. This is not about excluding people. It is about making the guidance usable at the moment of decision. A scaling guideline can still be broadly accessible, but it should not require the reader to guess what to do next. It should also connect back to the policy principle it supports, because that connection helps people understand why the guideline exists and what it is trying to protect. When readers can see the intent, they are more likely to follow the guideline even when the exact situation differs from the examples they have seen. The next ingredient is specificity without brittleness, because scaling guidelines must be concrete enough to reduce ambiguity while still being flexible enough to survive change. A brittle guideline reads like a hidden procedure where it quietly assumes one environment and one workflow, which breaks the moment a team operates differently. A vague guideline reads like a wish, where it tells people to be secure without giving them any direction that helps them choose between options. A strong guideline uses plain language to describe preferred patterns and decision criteria, such as recommending that access be limited by role, that sensitive actions be auditable, or that changes be reviewed based on impact. The guideline should also express safe defaults, because safe defaults reduce risk when information is incomplete. If a team is unsure whether an action increases exposure, a safe default might be to choose the option that reduces access scope or increases visibility, then seek clarification. That approach standardizes judgment rather than standardizing tools, which is exactly what makes guidelines scale. Because guidelines often coexist with mandatory requirements, a scaling guideline must be clear about how it relates to policy, standards, and procedures, or else teams will argue about whether it is required. Policy states what must be true. Standards typically define required characteristics. Procedures define required steps for specific tasks, and guidelines recommend preferred patterns when there are multiple workable methods. If a guideline contains a requirement that truly must be enforced, that requirement should usually be moved into a standard or procedure so enforcement expectations are clear. When enforcement and recommendation are mixed, organizations end up with conflict, where one team treats the guideline as optional while another treats it as mandatory. That inconsistency creates rework because the same question gets relitigated in different rooms. A scaling guideline should therefore be written with careful language that signals recommendation, while still being confident and practical. It should also point to the places where mandatory constraints exist, so teams know which boundaries they cannot cross even as they choose their implementation path. Guidelines scale across teams when they align with how teams make decisions, which often means aligning with trade-offs teams care about, such as speed, reliability, and clarity. Security guidance that ignores those trade-offs can be technically correct but socially ignored, because teams feel it does not respect their reality. A practical guideline acknowledges that friction exists and then recommends patterns that reduce risk with minimal unnecessary friction. For example, a guideline might recommend designing for least privilege while also recommending automation or self-service patterns that reduce manual approvals. The key is to avoid pretending the trade-off does not exist, because pretending creates distrust, and distrust drives workarounds. A guideline that is honest about trade-offs can still be firm about outcomes, such as protecting sensitive resources, while being flexible about methods. This also helps when teams disagree, because the guideline provides a shared reference point for discussing trade-offs instead of turning every debate into a personality contest. Over time, this shared reference point is what creates cultural consistency. Scaling across tools requires a special kind of discipline, because tools change frequently, while security intent should remain stable. A guideline should describe what evidence is needed and what controls must achieve, not how a particular product menu should be clicked. For example, a guideline might recommend that critical actions produce logs that can be correlated and reviewed, rather than describing how to configure a specific logging system. This approach makes the guidance resilient to migration, acquisitions, and redesigns, which are common sources of governance failure. It also allows different teams to map the same guideline to their own tool chains, which reduces friction and increases adoption. Beginners sometimes worry that tool-agnostic guidance is too abstract, but the solution is to include concrete outcomes and examples rather than tool steps. If the guideline specifies what good looks like in observable terms, like timely detection or auditable changes, teams can implement it with different tools and still produce comparable outcomes. Tool-agnostic does not mean vague, it means portable. Practical guidelines also scale better when they include the reasoning that a beginner can apply, because without reasoning, people treat guidelines as arbitrary rules. Reasoning does not mean writing a long essay. It means clearly stating what failure mode the guideline is trying to prevent. If a guideline recommends minimizing shared accounts, the reasoning is that shared accounts reduce accountability and make misuse harder to detect. If a guideline recommends separating duties for sensitive actions, the reasoning is that separation reduces the chance that one mistake or one malicious actor can cause full harm. When the reasoning is clear, Teams can apply the guideline in new scenarios without demanding a special exception every time reality shifts. This is also where guiding principles from the prior episode show their value, because guidelines that echo durable principles feel coherent rather than random. Coherence is what makes governance feel like a system instead of a pile of documents, and systems scale better than piles. For exam purposes, this coherence is often what distinguishes mature governance from ad hoc rulemaking. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Another core scaling idea is to design guidelines around reusable patterns, because reusable patterns reduce rework and reduce decision fatigue. In everyday operations, people face the same classes of decisions repeatedly, such as how to grant access, how to handle sensitive data, how to instrument systems for monitoring, and how to manage changes safely. If every team invents its own pattern, the organization ends up with fragmentation that is hard to secure and hard to audit. Guidelines can reduce fragmentation by recommending a small number of preferred patterns that are broadly applicable, such as standard ways of classifying data, standard ways of requesting access, or standard ways of capturing audit evidence. The guideline should not pretend there is only one right answer for every context, but it should narrow the space of acceptable answers to the patterns that consistently produce safer outcomes. This narrowing is what makes security posture more predictable, which makes it easier to defend and improve. Predictability is not rigidity, it is reliability, and reliability is what scaling requires. A scaling guideline also needs to anticipate the human side of adoption, because even the best guidance fails if people cannot find it, understand it, or trust it. In real operational life, people will not search for guidance for an hour when they are under deadline, so the guideline must be easy to locate and easy to apply. It should use consistent terminology with the rest of the organization's governance, because inconsistent terms create confusion that feels like the guidance is out of touch. It should also be written with a tone that supports collaboration, not blame, because people resist documents that feel like they were written to catch mistakes rather than to prevent them. A practical guideline invites teams to adopt a safer pattern by making it understandable and by showing how it reduces risk without creating unnecessary burden. Trust grows when teams see that guidelines reflect real operations rather than idealized operations. That trust is the difference between a guideline that sits in a repository and a guideline that becomes the default. Guidelines that scale also connect to measurable outcomes, because measurement is how an organization knows whether standardization is working. If guidelines recommend patterns that improve visibility, you should be able to observe improved visibility over time, even if different teams implement the pattern differently. If guidelines recommend reducing unnecessary access, you should be able to observe that access scope is shrinking toward legitimate need. This does not require complex analytics. It requires choosing a small number of signals that reflect the outcome and can be checked consistently. Measurement also helps resolve debates, because it shifts discussion from opinion to evidence. If a team claims a guideline is too burdensome, measurement can help determine whether the burden is real and whether the risk reduction is meaningful, which supports better trade-offs. For beginners, it is useful to remember that governance is not complete when the document is written. Governance is complete when the document changes behavior and produces better outcomes. Guidelines should therefore be designed with the question in mind of how the organization will know they are being followed in spirit and not just on paper. A frequent beginner misunderstanding is to think that standardization means removing all autonomy, but effective standardization actually preserves autonomy by giving it safer boundaries. Teams can still choose tools, architectures, and workflows, but the guidelines ensure those choices do not violate critical safety expectations. This boundary-setting approach reduces conflict because security does not have to approve every detail, and teams do not have to reinvent basic safety decisions. It also reduces the temptation for shadow practices, because teams feel they have room to operate without constant gatekeeping. The key is that the boundaries must be clear, and the guideline must explain what is flexible and what is not. If a guideline treats every detail as negotiable, standardization fails. If it treats every detail as fixed, adoption fails. Scaling guidelines find the balance by being firm on outcomes and flexible on methods, and that balance is one of the most important governance skills to develop. As organizations mature, guidelines also become a bridge for learning because they capture the lessons of what has worked across teams and what has failed. When a guideline is updated based on operational feedback, it becomes a shared memory that prevents repeating the same mistakes. This is especially important across teams because teams often do not have time to learn from each other organically, so fragmentation persists. Guidelines can accelerate maturity by spreading proven patterns quickly, which reduces risk more efficiently than isolated improvements. This is also why guidelines should have an owner and a review cadence, because stale guidance becomes a liability. If teams follow outdated guidance, they may implement patterns that no longer reduce risk effectively. A living guideline program treats guidance as an evolving asset, grounded in durable principles but responsive to new realities. That balance between durability and learning is what allows guidelines to endure while staying relevant. To close, choosing to standardize with practical guidelines is really choosing to scale judgment across an organization without demanding uniformity in every tool and workflow. Guidelines help teams make consistent, safer decisions in the large spaces between high-level policy and detailed procedures, and they reduce ambiguity that would otherwise lead to fragmentation and rework. The guidelines that scale are clear about intent, concrete about preferred patterns, portable across tools, honest about trade-offs, and connected to outcomes that can be observed. They also respect human reality by being easy to find, easy to apply, and written in a tone that supports collaboration. For exam thinking, remember that mature governance is not about producing more documents, but about producing the right documents that create consistent behavior at scale. When guidelines are practical and durable, they become a quiet multiplier, helping many teams make many decisions in the same safer direction without needing constant oversight. That is how standardization becomes sustainable, and that is how security programs become resilient as organizations grow.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.